My name is Code, and what I'm about to tell you isn't easy. A few years ago, I had an out-of-body experience. I died, and in that moment, I was taken straight to hell. There, I saw things no one would want to see, including a very famous religious leader. That turned my world upside down. It changed everything. Since I was little, my life has been full of ups and downs. I started using drugs very early, when I was only 10 years old. My parents had no idea, of course. Who would have thought that such a young child was already smoking substances? It was easy to hide. I grew up in a tough neighborhood, full of characters you could call gangsters or something like that. I spent a lot of time at their house, and that's where I also started drinking. But even after all of this, something inside me still tried to steer me in another direction. Sometimes I would even tell them, "We have to stop. It's in the Bible, you know." I grew up in a Christian home. I knew who God was. I knew the power of the name of Jesus. But at the same time, from a very young age, I was tormented by demons. I could barely sleep with the lights off. I left the lamp on and the door open. Until I was 17 or 18, it was a constant torment. I knew that all of this was real, that it was written in the Word. But it seemed like the only way to feel pleasure was to enjoy parties, sex, drugs, and everything everyone else did. They rebelled. So that's what I chose. This choice drove me deeper and deeper. I remember one particular night. I used an absurd dose of methadone, much more than I should have. After that, I started seeking out even harder substances. And when you enter this cycle of withdrawal, the pain is so unbearable that nothing else matters. You don't care about work, no one, nothing, everything revolves around one thing: to stop feeling that pain. One day, I woke up and found some crushed pills. I smelled it without thinking. I swallowed 10 more methadone pills. At the time, I was unemployed but receiving government assistance, so I didn't need to work. I basically lived the way I wanted. I went to the kitchen. I remembered a bottle of Everclear someone had given me and thought, "Do you know what I'm going to drink today?" I had nothing else to do. The house was empty. I started with a double dose, then another and another. When I realized, I'd already taken 5 or 6 doses. That's when everything changed. I returned to my room and as soon as I entered, I felt a presence. There was no doubt about it. Death was there. It wasn't just a feeling, it was real. It surrounded me and took me. Deep down, I knew I wasn't alone in that room. Something had come looking for me. I became desperate and begged him, "Jesus, please forgive my sins." That was all I could say. I knew I was living wrong and I knew exactly where I was headed. And suddenly, the moment I finished saying sin, I began to fall. The feeling was as if I were being dragged through an endless tunnel. Something gigantic grabbed me from behind. As if I were just a rag doll. I didn't even try to look back at the bottom. I knew it wouldn't help. That thing had total control over me. They were dragging me and the destination was clear, hell, and there in that infinite darkness, everything made sense, but there was no time to think. That was the reality of hell. My eyes could barely keep up with everything happening around me. It was like being in a horrible dream, but more real than anything I had ever felt while awake. I came to a tunnel. A dark and suffocating tunnel. Chains were in force on both sides. The first part was just that, chains. Screams of desperation. But what caught my attention the most was that I could hear their thoughts, as if I had connected to a super-advanced artificial intelligence. It was strange as I sped past them. I knew everything about these people. Everything. It really was as if I had instant access to each person's entire history, more than they could remember. If there were 1,000,000 souls there, I would know everything about each one without even trying. All you had to do was walk through them. And then, out of nowhere, I was transported, still inside that tunnel, but taken somewhere else. The first thing I heard was screams. People were shouting at the top of their lungs, "Get me out of here. Here I am a Christian. as if that were an exit pass, and the strangest thing was that they thought I was a Christian too. They felt it in me as I passed by. But there in that place, that didn't mean anything. Suddenly, bam, we stopped, like a UFO had stopped dead in its tracks. It didn't hurt or anything. It just stopped. And then I saw him. An endless line of people, each dressed in clothes from different eras. There were people from all eras, from the beginning of humanity to modern times. Americans, Asians, Africans, Europeans, all the side by side, waiting for who knows what. And every thought, every memory, every feeling of theirs was laid out before me. But it was one man who caught my attention. A white man, without even knowing how, I was pulled straight into his mind. My eyes focused on his hands and arms, and then I understood. He was abusing a child. When I realized what was happening, I panicked. No, I don't want to see that. I closed my eyes tightly, begging to get out of there, and I left. But even in that brief moment, I felt everything he felt, all the torment, all the anguish. He wasn't enjoying it at all. It wasn't pleasant, it was like a nightmare that repeated itself forever. The scene wasn't real, but for him, it was as if it were. He couldn't stop. It was an endless cycle, and he knew it. He knew he was trapped in that suffering forever, and that's where one of the biggest lies people believe comes from. Hell is partying, it's chaos, it's freedom. It isn't, there's no fun. The toughest guy you know, the biggest Satan fanatic, the most insensitive, will cry like a child. The strongest will collapse. You'll beg to leave, but no one ever leaves. Time is different. You know that phrase? Time flies when we're having fun. That's how it is in hell. Time passes slowly. It's suffocating. While I was there, I wasn't really aware of the passage of time. But when I came back, it felt like I'd been there for 4 full days. In fact, they had only passed a few hours, from noon to 4 p.m. After this experience with that man, I felt something moving again. I was dragged. Something or someone was dragging me somewhere else. A figure, maybe the angel of death. I don't know, but it was taking me towards something different. It was a castle, but not just any castle. It was like it was made of pearls. Underground, yes, but incredibly beautiful. It shone, and then I knew there was more to come. When I got closer, I saw a huge door. It looked like something straight out of a medieval movie, like the ones in King Arthur's castles. It was made of solid, dark wood with one of those iron rings like the ones you see on a bull's snout. Just by looking at it, you could feel the weight of the place. We approached, and the door opened. No one pushed it. It just opened by itself. Inside, everything was brightly lit, even beautiful. But when I walked through, that light ended up in a long, dark hallway. To the left and right, prison cells, lots of things. A heavy silence filled the air. It was at that moment that something happened that I don't even know how to explain. It was as if all the information from that place began to fall inside me, straight into my spirit. I didn't read it, no one said it, but I did. You knew. It was a completely different knowledge. There was no room for doubt. Nothing to question. It was solid. It was as if it had been tattooed on me. Only you knew. That was the part of hell where the false leaders, the false prophets, were. People who, instead of leading others to Jesus, turned them away, and that's why they took people to hell. Every religion that denies Jesus as the only way was represented there, and those who deceived others by saying, "This is the way." When it wasn't, this castle was their destination. As if this place was saying, "You deceived thousands, then welcome to what you deserve." If I wanted to, I could know anything. Like, what color is the roof of this castle? And the answer would come. It was all so accessible, but I didn't want to know. I wasn't interested in the details. I just wanted to understand what was happening to me, and mainly where I was going. I continued to be guided by the angel of death, or whatever that entity was, still attracted me. I had no control. I was a puppet, powerless, voiceless, only fear. A fear that froze my soul. I went through several cells. Some didn't even have doors. The people there could leave, but they didn't. They seemed trapped inside, not outside. They were wearing all kinds of clothes. I even saw a man dressed like a monk, but I didn't stop. I didn't investigate. I didn't look much. I was focused on what would come next because fear was greater than curiosity. In the middle of that silent and heartbreaking walk, something, or rather someone, caught my attention. It was a different man, wearing old clothes similar to Abraham Lincoln's from the 19th century, from the colonial era. And that stopped me. I don't know why. There was something about him. I didn't just see him, I was drawn to him instead of just observing from the outside, like I did with the others. I entered directly into his mind. I was thrown there as if connected to his trance. He stood there motionless with his eyes closed, murmuring things under his breath. I entered that state with him, and look, it didn't seem like an imaginary place. It wasn't a dream, it was real as everything I've experienced so far. It was as if that moment were actually happening. As if I were living it with him, not just observing. And it was there that something even deeper began to reveal itself when I entered that trance with the man. Everything suddenly changed. We were no longer in that dark castle or in the cell block corridor. Now we were outside, in a place lit by a warm and welcoming sun. The sky was blue. The birds were singing. The wind was gentle. For a second, I felt peace. He was there. Standing there, a little confused, his foot brushing the grass as if he were testing if it was real, and honestly, it really seemed like it, the kind of bright green grass swaying in the wind. I looked and thought, where are we? This isn't hell anymore. It seemed like good news for a moment. I almost believed it was all over, but something inside me told me it wasn't, and then I started to hear his thoughts. It was like he was trying to convince himself, I'm home, this is my garden. I'm home. But you could feel something was wrong. It was like déjà vu, like he'd been there before, but he couldn't remember exactly. Slowly, he saw a simple, two-story house made of weathered wood, something like an old barn. But when he looked at it, he thought again, this is home, it's here. And then he started walking faster, as if he were excited, and soon he was running toward the house like someone returning from a long journey. That's when the atmosphere changed. Before I even reached the door, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. A strange, heavy, evil sound, as if something was moving inside, something alive and full of anger. I knew immediately that there were bad things there. It wasn't just noise, it was a suffocating energy, like growls and a language that wasn't of this world. It was frustrating, irritating, demonic, and suddenly, without warning, they pulled me away, lifted me off the ground, and I began to fly toward the second floor of the house. With everything, they threw me against the wall. Poop. And the moment I called out, everything went black. I lost my vision, I lost my hearing, and there was absolute silence. But it wasn't just silence, it was a deadly emptiness, as if I had died again. Then my vision returned. My ears opened, and I saw myself there on the top floor of the house. What I saw was disturbing. Two creatures stared at me. Demons had faces similar to those of crocodiles, but grotesquely deformed and covered in a thick, gooey substance. They reminded me a bit of those gargoyles from the Hunchback of Notre Dame, only much worse. A cross between a crocodile and a slug, something so disturbing it hurt to look at. They spoke in a language that seemed spewed from the depths. I couldn't repeat it or remember it. A heavy, wet sound filled with saliva and hatred. And although I didn't understand the words, I knew and felt what they wanted. They were frustrated, arguing, trying to understand how to get the man outside to go up to the top floor. They wanted him to come in. They wanted him to go through the door and up the stairs. I looked toward the stairs, hoping to see him coming, but something strange happened. I could see everything at the same time. I saw the inside of the house, the floor above with the demons, and at the same time, I saw through the wall. I saw the man still outside, standing in the doorway, confused. It was like having two overlapping points of view, and neither one got in the way of the other. It was spiritual, totally beyond human logic. He stood there on the threshold, his gaze lost, as if trying to remember something. That feeling of debuts was still strong within him, but now it was different. He felt something was wrong. Fear gripped him. He no longer believed that this was his home. He wasn't sure of anything. Joy gave way to doubt, and doubt turned into panic. He was almost entering, but he stopped, and in that moment, I knew. They were testing him. This wasn't his home. It was a trap. He was stuck with his feet on the threshold. His face confused, his chest heavy with fear. It was as if a part of him knew this was still part of hell. And so it was. His thoughts came like waves. Deep fear, doubt, insecurity. He wanted to believe that he was home, but he couldn't. Something was preventing him from taking the next step. He stood frozen there. And while he hesitated, the demons began to act. Those two, who looked like deformed crocodiles, changed positions. One of them turned his head and looked directly at me. The man's gaze was like a horror movie. It wasn't a human gaze, it wasn't just the creature that saw me, it was what was inside it looking through me, the kind of gaze we see when someone is possessed, you know. It's not the person's eyes, it's the eyes of what lives inside them. That's what I saw, and then it spoke to me, not with words, but directly into my mind. It was a telepathic communication, but the strangest thing was that it used my own voice. The way we think when we wake up in the morning and think, I'll make coffee. It was as if I had thought it myself, but it wasn't me. It said inside my head, call him. My answer came the same way, without even planning it. I won't help you. And at the same moment, it turned toward the other demon. It was as if they had already predicted it. They began to move like someone beginning a ritual. The atmosphere in the room changed. They began to emit grotesque sounds, a demonic language. Impossible to imitate, it was like hearing corruption itself materialize into sound. A call, an invocation. That's when something began to emerge. A strange shape that looked like a square the size of a folded cloth or two stacked socks, but that was much more than appearance. Wherever that thing passed, the ground shattered. Not only did it break, it disappeared, as if they were digging an endless hole there, an abyss opening up, consuming everything. The earth was swallowed as if it had never existed. Instinctively, I took a step back. That's when it began to spin. It reminded me of the Taz demon from the cartoons, running furiously, only it was dark and dangerous. It began to glow, and as it spun, it expanded and grew. The thing took shape and transformed in front of me. A gigantic figure appeared, something like a golden angel, but without wings. It had an indescribable beauty. It was attractive in an almost hypnotic way. For a moment, I thought, she's a woman, but there was no way of knowing. She had soft, seductive features, but there was also a demonic presence. There was something behind that beauty that caused repulsion and discomfort. It was as if my spirit was screaming, this is not what it seems to be. The creature was about 3.5 meters tall, twice my father's height. It was immense, and everything was made of gold. Every part of its body had a different golden hue. The eyes had a darker, almost black pupil surrounded by a lighter golden glow. The skin was also golden, but it varied in depth and intensity, as if the light itself were alive within. Beautiful, yes, but false, seductive, but deadly. And I realized they weren't just trying to deceive this man. They were also trying to deceive me. The situation became even more surreal when that golden being began to communicate with the two demons. It didn't look at them directly, but its presence was so imposing that the other two immediately stepped back, obeying as if they were nothing more than servants before a commander. I couldn't understand its language, but it was clear it was giving a clear order. Some kind of command that made them disappear, crossing the wall in total obedience. Now I was there alone with the gigantic being, and to my surprise, he didn't look at me. There was no movement to suggest he noticed me. I was there, invisible like a fly on the wall, and that only increased my fear. What terrified me wasn't just the size of that being, which seemed capable of destroying anything, but the fact that he couldn't see me. I was in a space where everyone ignored me, and that made me feel even smaller, as if I had no value there. I was afraid that at some point he would look at me and all that strength and power would turn against me, but he didn't. Then he began to call out to the man. The voice that came out of him was indescribable, unlike any sound I had ever heard. It was a mixture of music and speech, a melody that seemed to emerge from the air itself. It wasn't an organ or a flute. It was something completely new to my ears. Something that vibrated around everything, filling the space with an unusual harmony. The vibration of his voice seemed to dominate the entire environment, as if the sound itself was somehow in tune with the essence of the place. I knew this wasn't common, it was something that had a force, a presence that couldn't be ignored. I couldn't connect it to what Esquiel had described, but I knew the sound came from pure power and also deception. While this was happening, the man was still standing outside, looking lost, believing he was home. I realized he was in a deep trance, being deceived by everything. He didn't know it, but this golden being was guiding him very convincingly. He believed it was real, but it was just a clever deception. The wonderful voice echoed once again, and I heard the sound of the door opening as if the house were disintegrating with the sound of that music. The man then began to quickly climb the stairs, as if something was attracting him, but upon taking the first step, he fell, throwing himself face down on the floor as if he were beginning to worship this being. And it was at that moment that I realized he had seen this before. This voice, this sound, this power. He was familiar with it all. He felt a kind of security, a sense of comfort, as if everything he needed was there, ready to be accepted. He prostrated himself on the floor, worshipping it. I realized he was completely immersed in this worship. Unaware that he was being manipulated, the golden being then, with impressive gentleness, lifted him up. His soft voice almost seemed to bring relief to the man, as if he were watching over him. He placed him standing up. He suddenly gestured. The house we were looking at disappeared before my eyes, and now we were in an immense place, an endless crowd, as if it were a party. The view was like a macabre version of Woodstock, with thousands, maybe millions of people scattered as far as the eye could see. The golden being led the man to the edge of that crowd and made a movement as if to say, "Preach to them, pass on to them the message I gave you." The being stepped back a little, and at that moment, the man began to speak to the crowd. What caught my attention was the golden being's gesture with his arms raised. He began to create shapes in the air, something like floating hieroglyphics. But they weren't ordinary hieroglyphics. They were symbols. Images that looked like vivid drawings made of an invisible material floating around him. They were identical to Egyptian hieroglyphics, but at the same time, something about them seemed different. More alive, more present, and more connected to the power that the being emanated. They were there in the air, floating and transforming, as if they were a sign for everyone around them. I stood there, completely paralyzed by the scene unfolding before me. The golden being seemed to have absolute control over everything. Now, standing in front of that crowd, the man was completely dominated. He was ready to preach the message that had been given to him while those magical hieroglyphics floated above him, as if this entire scenario were being orchestrated by a force invisible, and I knew that all this was happening under an evil power disguised as beauty and harmony. 6 symbols floated around him, floating slowly in the air. The man had his back to us and spoke with silent authority as if he were pronouncing words that echoed from some distant place. As he spoke, one of the hieroglyphs began to glow, but instead of spinning naturally as I expected, it moved strangely, spinning in the opposite direction. It was as if he was going back in time, moving away instead of forward. As he continued preaching, the symbol glowed even brighter and soon transformed, revealing another one. He repeated the cycle, each hieroglyph transforming as he continued his speech. I didn't understand a word of what he was saying, but it was clear he was conveying a message from someone or something that had spoken to him before. However, I didn't hear the message itself. I only saw his movements as if it were a recording. That's when something strange happened. I saw the golden being begin to smile, but it wasn't just any smile, it was something evil, twisted like the Grinch's smile in a cartoon. His once calm face began to contort, becoming completely menacing. His mouth opened, and from it spurted what appeared to be some sort of golden saliva. A soft, light golden hue. The scene was horrifying. I didn't understand what was happening, but the feeling of dread only increased. Suddenly, I began to hear screams coming from the crowd. At first, it was just an isolated voice, but soon the screams multiplied. People began to shout their words filled with anger. "Get down here, you big liar!" Someone shouted, "You are the reason we are here." "Hell," another one continued, "come down now, we're going to beat you until you pay for everything you've done. Do you think you're going to fool us with those lies again?" The curses echoed everywhere, getting louder and louder. The voices mingled together, but the threats were clear. This time I wouldn't escape. That sound enveloped me, and as the words from the crowd grew louder, I could feel the man above begin to change. He stopped talking, and his expression became tense, filled with confusion and fear. The whole time, I felt like I was connected to him, as if his thoughts were mingling with mine. That's when he realized, I'm not preaching to a crowd. He thought, this isn't like when he was on Earth. At first, he seemed distracted, believing himself to be a leader, someone important, a star. But now the pieces were starting to fall into place, and finally, he realized something was seriously wrong. His eyes opened wide in terror as he heard the threats from the crowd surrounding him. "Get down now," they said. "We're going to destroy." I could hear every word, and the fear only grew on his face. Meanwhile, I observed everything around me. The angel, the crowd, the tension in the air. I was trying to understand what was happening, to absorb the scene in its entirety. But then the surroundings began to shake. Something seemed to be moving, maybe a shelf falling or a painting being knocked over. The sound frightened me. A shiver ran down my spine, and instantly, the feeling of fear invaded me. Without warning, I was sucked upwards as if I were being taken to the moon. My body floated, and I saw the angel again, now more distant. While everything around me began to disappear, the man was preaching to a large crowd, an endless mass of people that stretched as far as the eye could see. The house around him was collapsing, like a movie scene, something like what I saw in The Wizard of Oz when everything starts to collapse. I was so immersed in that vision that I lost focus of what was happening, but nevertheless, the man continued speaking. That sea of faces, the fury of the people was palpable, and he was beginning to realize. It was then that he stopped speaking. The atmosphere seemed to change the instant he fell silent. From behind the crowd, something strange began to happen. Two crocodile-like creatures appeared. They had disappeared before, but now they had returned. The golden angel had sent them to fulfill a task, and they were there with a dark purpose. They approached the front of the crowd, holding hands with the man's children. The girl who caught my attention the most was a little girl wearing a simple dress and holding a teddy bear. She looked at the man and said with devastating purity, "Dad, why did you lie to us?" At that moment, the man, the false prophet, was hit by a wave of regret and hopelessness. I felt it so intensely that I began to choke, as if I were about to vomit. The weight of regret was crushing. He began to understand for the first time the gravity of the situation he was in. He realized he was in hell. His family was there too, and the fact that he would never leave that place was like a ton of bricks had fallen on him. The impact of the pain and guilt was so great that the crushing sensation felt physical as I was struggling with anxiety and barely breathing. Something strange happened. The surroundings suddenly began to change. We were back in the garden, as if time had gone backward. I was there with him, watching him touch the grass, trying to see if it was real, as if I were living the same moment over and over again, like it was Groundhog Day. The cycle seemed to start all over again, and again. They tricked him. They made him believe he wasn't in hell. I understood that this was part of his torment, putting him in that illusion. Only to then crush him with reality, with guilt, with the pain of knowing where he really was. When I realized the cycle was starting again, a feeling of despair came over me. I didn't know how, but something suddenly changed. They pulled me out of that scene, not really knowing what was happening. It wasn't the angel of death, but I was back. Now I was in the hallway of that castle, looking at the man's cell. He began to push me toward the hallway, and our direction changed. We headed to a darker part of the castle, an underground section, a different rocky terrain. Everything we had seen before. I began to understand this was the next step, the place I was heading to, and as soon as I realized this, panic gripped me. I didn't have time to prepare. That's when an intense light appeared. It was as if Jesus had approached me, coming toward me, lifting me up like a child. I can't fully describe it, but it was as if he had picked me up, lifting me from under my feet, placing me very close to his chest. I knew without a doubt that it was Jesus. He was the light of salvation. When I stood up, everything became clear, and an intense glow illuminated everything around me. Suddenly, I found myself falling to the floor of my house, as if I had woken up from a nightmare. When I fell to the floor of my house, I wasn't with Jesus, nor with the angel of death, nor with anyone. I was there alone in my own apartment, coming back to life, but completely traumatized. The feeling of being back was surreal. My ex-wife came through the door, and in a state of total panic, the door in my face was shaking with surprise, as if I were still trapped in that nightmare. I couldn't believe what I had just experienced. Never before or since had I felt so scared. I was in a state of total disbelief. I didn't know how to react, how to process all of that. The people who say this was just a dream or something in my head have no idea what really happened. They weren't there. They don't know what I went through. If they had experienced that, not for a second would they believe it was an illusion. I was physically in that place, and for me, nothing was more real than that. That was more real than anything I've ever experienced, more real even than our conversation just now. The reality I lived in that moment was tangible, clear, concrete. What we are living now is just a shadow compared to what I experienced. That was the true reality. The rest of this here is like a dream. Some might think it was just a dream or that I was using drugs. But I've tried many substances in my life, and I know what it's like to hallucinate. You don't hallucinate with methadone. You don't hallucinate with Everclear. I've lived my entire life dealing with this and I've never, ever experienced anything like this. What I experienced was real. I really died and I really went to that place. I know it without a doubt. I gain nothing from this. I don't sell books, I don't ask for donations. In fact, I only receive criticism and threats. There are people who call me a liar, they offend me, and every time I tell my testimony, whether on a podcast or in church, something bad always happens. I've fought with my wife over this, and negative things always happen. When I share this story, before and after I tell it, it seems like the negativity only increases. This happened to me before. But after I started talking about what I went through, the situation intensified, so for me, there's nothing positive about it. I simply lose. The only benefit I can receive is when I get to heaven and Jesus can pat me on the back and tell me I did the right thing. The truth is, this whole process has been a sacrifice. There's no reason for me to make this up. I'm not making anything up if anyone doesn't believe it. It's because you don't know what you're talking about. What I experienced was real, and I'm telling it now because for a long time I kept it to myself. The Holy Spirit convinced me it was time to share. I didn't see any benefit in telling this story. In fact, every time I talked about it, it only caused me more problems. The first time I talked about what I experienced was one morning before waking up, I heard the sound of cursed human voices saying things like code, kill, code, destroy. It was like a negative chant, a direct curse, as if I had woken up and spent about 30 seconds listening to those voices. That was only the beginning of the torment. I started to think that maybe there were witches around me or something similar. Something I knew somehow was going to tell what I experienced. Maybe it was a demonic force. But the voices sounded very human. They were cursing me, trying to stop me. All of this happened before I told my story. But the worst came when I tried to tell it. Something strange happened. My vocal cords felt locked, as if I couldn't speak properly. I was trying to express myself on stage, but all I could do was choke, and I felt completely humiliated. Then a formally dressed man started yelling at me, saying that I had no right to be the representing Jesus. He embarrassed me in ways I can't describe. I was dealing with that curse in the morning, and now with that man humiliating me, my throat seemed to close even more. When I got home that night, it was the first time I shared everything with someone, and I was reliving the trauma. I didn't feel good or comfortable. This topic is difficult for me. Every time I think or talk about what I went through, I still feel something inside. The experience affected me deeply, and I'm only speaking now because the Holy Spirit convinced me to do so that night. Lying in bed, my ex-wife was sleeping. That's when that entity appeared.